In Namibia, one needs to have attained the minimum age of 18 before you are allowed to cast your vote in a national election. Moreover, in the event that you aspire to become the country's president, the supreme law of the land insists that is only possible if you are 35 years or older. Interestingly, neither a statute nor the Constitution stipulates a maximum age for those who want to run for political office. Greetings, Namibia, and welcome to the Wheels of Justice with me, Daniel Nadunya. In this episode, we take a closer look at our constitutional democracy and one of its cornerstones, that is the rule of law. Amongst others, would like to explore what impact amending electoral laws would have on democracy by allowing younger people to vote, as well as placing a cap on the age of those who may stand for the public office, that is the presidency. Do fasten your seat belts, and the wheels of justice will be grinding into motion just soon. We'll return in a jiffy. Welcome back. You are watching the Wheels of Justice, and joining us for this evening's engagement is Mr. Emmanuel Thomas. That's an associate at Dupisani Legal Practitioners, and advocate Mark Oppenheimer, member of the Johannesburg Bar. Greetings, Leonard friends. Thank you for coming back. It's good to have you back on the Wheels of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Nadunya. It's good to be back.
Advocate, are you online?
Yes, wonderful to be here. I'm struggling to see you guys, but I'll try my best.
Thank you so much. I hope technology will allow us to have this conversation without any interruption. Now, perhaps, is there any point in limine that we need to get rid of before we...
I don't think so, Mr. Nadunya. I think we might as well just get into it.
Thank you so much. In both jurisdictions, that is Namibia and South Africa, a citizen needs to have attained the minimum of at least 18 years before they become eligible to vote. Perhaps, what do you make of this?
Well, Mr. Nadunya, from a Namibian perspective, I would say that is enforced, or that is made pragmatic by our constitutional dispensation and by our constitution.
Right.
In terms of Article 17, it allows for political activity or for political participation of our citizens. But moreover than that, the Constitution clearly stipulates that everybody that is over the age of 18 is allowed to vote. So on that front alone, the age restriction or capacity the legal capacity to vote has already been set by the Constitution.
Advocate Oppenheimer, what do you make of this provision? Advocate, are you with us? Well, I think there is some kind of connection problem with Advocate there. But in fact, let's maybe expand it a little bit more. During the registration which took place this year, of course, in preparation for our November polls, the ECN, which is the Electoral Commission of Namibia, made it very clear that, in fact, if by the end of the registration, which was the 1st of August, one has not attained 18 years, they would simply not be allowed to cast a vote, even if they turn 18 just prior to the election, which is in November. What do you make? What do you think? Is that fair enough?
Well, perhaps it is something that the ECN in itself can take a lesson from, particularly in the context of increasing and broadening the participation in the election process for those that have attained the age of 18 before the date of voting.
Yes.
For instance, it does not mean that we have to do away with the end of the registration period. However, they can supplement that period with those people that attain the age of 18 before the voting period to allow for these particular people to register, because in terms of the Constitution, they are in fact entitled and eligible to be voters in this particular country. So perhaps it's a lesson to be learned or something that they can do going on in the future.
Especially because voting is taking place at the time when they've then attained
Indeed so,
the
indeed
age.
so, indeed so, Mr. Nadunya.
Now, other jurisdictions allow voting as younger as 16. Let's take an example of Brazil, Argentina. Some even allow at the age of 17 for one to cast their vote. Indonesia and Greece are some of those jurisdictions. Why is there no universal, perhaps, minimum age for eligibility to vote?
Well, that is a good question. To answer that question, one would have to compare, or one would have to look at the historical dynamics of each and every specific country, the laws of that particular country, particularly relating to the constitution of that particular country, and what the legal age of majority is in that country. Because voting is more often than not linked to the age of majority, and those that are over the age of majority can vote. So in some of these countries, the age is 16. In other countries, the age is 17, and therefore those people are particularly supposed to allowed to vote.
Yes, but that speaks to capacity, isn't it? Now, can one argue that a 16-year-old human being in Brazil has better capacity, that capacity to elect or choose a leader,
and that is why,
as opposed to one in Namibia that can only mature at 18?
Well, and that is why I'm saying it also depends on the historical context of certain different countries.
Yes.
For instance, when you take a look at countries like Brazil, countries like Ecuador, Latin American countries, their suffrage, their right to vote, or the particular idea of voting has been reduced for those particular people. Ever since the 70s, 80s, the voting age has been lowered. So the dynamics of that particular demographic says that most young people vote there. And most countries have started assimilating that particular practice of allowing young voters to vote. But more often than not, it depends on the sovereignty of a country and the constitution of that particular country. If let's say, for instance, the historical context of this country has had it that most of this country has been in turmoil and whatnot, and then a revolution comes. Obviously, most revolutions are led by young people.
Yes.
So in order to accommodate these particular young people in that particular country, you would have to lower or allow those people around the age of revolution to be able to vote, and therefore you find lower voting ages in different jurisdictions or in different countries.
Well, I'm tempted to ask, how young is too young? In your opinion?
How young is too young
Yes.
also depends specifically on social, economic context. It also depends on the legal age of majority of each and every country.
Yes.
Constitutions describe or set a certain age at which people are allowed to get married, allowed to start working, allowed to enter into contracts. That particular age is called the age of majority. Each and every country's age of majority is usually the threshold upon which a particular person is allowed to vote. And therefore, how young depends on how low is the age of majority, simply put.
Right. I mean, one may argue that at 16, one could give consent. Is that correct?
Indeed, so consent in a different context as well.
Yes.
There is consent for to enter into sexual relations, but that consent can also vary or deviate. Right?
Yes.
But that does not mean that it gives you or it entitles you to vote. That specifically is tied to the legal age of majority.
Let's see if the good advocate is back online. Advocate, are you there?
Yes, I may suffer the risk of repeating things that have been said by your guest because I can't hear what you're saying, but I gather you can hear what I'm saying.
We
so
can
I'll
hear
try
you.
my best.
Yes, we can hear you. Just perhaps, what do you make of the cap that is been there, the age restriction per se, if we have to put it that way, for one to be allowed to vote? I mean, in both jurisdictions, that is both South Africa and Namibia, it's the same. One needs to be 18. What do you make of that?
Well, I'll try and weigh in on this. So I think if you think about why you would set an age for any kind of legal action, it's meant to be a proxy for something else. So the idea is that we think that when you're 18, you're rational, that you have a sense of your own interests, and that you may be good at not causing significant harm to others. So, for example, we have a legal age of drinking, and we have legal ages for sexual consent. So the idea that if you are beneath that age, you lack the capacity. Now, with voting, we might think that you're making an incredibly important choice in that you are working out not only who will govern you, but who will govern others. And so if we took age out of the equation and said anyone who can perform the act of voting, so make an X on a piece of paper, can vote, you could include toddlers, for example. And you might think that toddlers have not much awareness of their own self-interests. They might vote in a way that was arbitrary, or they might be subject to the pressure of their parents who would say, make sure you put your X on the highest most box or the lowest most box without knowing what the significance of that act was. So there is some reason to have a voting age, and the question is whether 18 really does the correct job. Is it matching our expectations of capacity, or is it overly arbitrary in that it's over-inclusive or under-inclusive?
Yes. What do you make of other countries or other jurisdictions where one is allowed to vote at the age of 16, and it works perfectly well for them? Is it something worth emulating for our jurisdictions?
Well, you might ask who it works well for. So you can imagine some political parties have a lot more support among the youth, and so that it would suit them to lower the voting age to 14. So you might think that those between the ages of 14 and 18 form a certain kind of political class who might have an interest in how high schools are run, or be more willing to entertain ideas that are, let's say, more radical, or that don't directly affect them. So, for example, if you're 14, you're unlikely to pay income tax. And so you might be very happy for a party that says, we'll hike up the income taxes and we'll spend that money on tertiary education. You're not feeling the hurt of that, but you're getting the benefit. So a certain kind of party might very well want to change the age of voting. Another kind might want to say, well, we think it would be in our interests to narrow the voting age, to only let people vote once they have other capacities. So if you think about South Africa's history, we had a qualified franchise, so which required people to own property. And the argument for that was, well, you're invested in your society because you're a property owner, but also there's lots of people who don't own property who might have an interest in who governs them.
Yes. Mr. Emmanuel, what's your take on that?
No. I definitely agree with what Advocate Oppenheimer is saying. You cannot deviate from the fact that society's also impact and history has impacted the voting age across the board, if so to say. I think I've spoken on that, so
yes.
I think it would be best if we...
Yes. Many constitutions list age as a ground upon which a human being should not be discriminated against. Do you think the existence of the minimum age for one to vote amounts to discrimination?
Well, I'll start it from a Namibian context.
Yes.
That question specifically. In Namibia, different grounds are listed in the constitution in our equality and non-discrimination clause,
Yes.
or the provision. But I can tell you now specifically the age is not a consideration in terms of discrimination. But also when you look at the definition of discrimination, is treating people differently to their disadvantage, all right? There is a need to define what discrimination is and what kind of discrimination we're talking about here, because from a legal context, there are two types of discrimination. There is unjustified discrimination and there's reasonable or justified discrimination.
Right.
So when you talk about the age factor and considerations such as voting, if that particular differentiation is proportional to the reason as into why it was first brought in the first place, then one would say it is justified discrimination, because it is not like a blanket, prohibition that takes away everybody's rights, but it is put there to maintain a particular structure, specifically within our context,
Yes.
where the Constitution already says only people over the age of 18
Yes.
may vote.
Yes.
So you cannot then come and say, I'm 16, I must vote.
But let's go by the first definition that you gave in terms of what discrimination could be. Now, you say treating people or a person different in a way or in a manner that disadvantages them. Can one say that, look, I live in this country and you every time dictates to me who should be my leader?
Okay.
By a mere fact that you are not allowing me to participate in that election, in that choosing. Therefore, I feel disadvantaged.
Okay. And that is why I created the distinction between the types of discrimination we're talking about.
Yes.
There is unjustified discrimination.
Right.
And you just creating a blanket, people must not vote, or people under the age of 21 must not vote. While there is a legitimate reasoning from the Constitution that says only people over the age of 18 may vote, you cannot then, that limitation has already been set by the Constitution, and it may be discrimination, but that particular discrimination is justified for a particular purpose. And as long as that purpose is not restrictive, so restrictive that it does not achieve the aim of the bigger context of the Constitution,
Yes.
which is allowing adults or people with the legal age to vote, then you cannot say particularly that it is unjustified discrimination. And
but do we then agree that it's discrimination but probably justified?
I can concede to the fact that there may be discrimination there,
Yes.
but justified discrimination.
Yes. Advocate, your Leonard friend with me here just considered that they could be discrimination but probably justified. Do you agree?
I'm going to pretend I know what you're asking me, but I don't. And I'm going to assume that it has something to do with whether it's wrong to discriminate on the grounds of age. Now, the South African Constitution lists age and race and a range of other things as the kinds of class groups that you can't discriminate against. But you can't discriminate against them unfairly. And so the real work is in the unfair bit. In South Africa, we also talk about direct and indirect discrimination, and this might be something worth thinking about. So you can imagine having a rule that said that all voters have to be blonde in order to vote. Now, this doesn't directly discriminate on the grounds of race, but let's say people of Asian descent are highly unlikely to be born as blondes, and so it indirectly discriminates on the grounds of race. But when you have a voting law that says you can't vote until you turn 18, it's direct discrimination. And the question is it fair? And it could only be fair if there was a good reason to have that act of discrimination. If we could say that the age matters in some significant way. Now, there is some level of universal consensus around the world in terms of what age people can vote in. It seems to range between 16 on the low end and 25 at the upper end. But there's also a sense in which these rules have been around for a very long time and may no longer track the capacities of the young. So if you think about how much access to information is available for youngsters nowadays, how much they can find out about political parties, how informed they can be when they exercise their vote, it's gone up dramatically. If you think about access to the internet and to cell phones, you might think that the deliberative processes that a 14-year-old can engage in today are very similar to those of a 25-year-old 30 years ago. And so locking in the age might very well be an act of unfair discrimination, because it's no longer a good proxy for the thing that we actually care about, which is, are you aware of the consequences of your decisions? In South Africa, we have a couple of other age-related things. So we have a category called doli and capax. So if you're under the age of 7 and you perform what would otherwise be a criminal act, like murder, you are not at all liable. So if a 5-year-old kills someone else, we don't hold them liable. Up to 14, we have a kind of rebuttable presumption. So you can be held criminally liable if you're 14, but we assume that you lack the capacity, but that can be rebutted based on the individual characteristics of the person. And I think this is an important thing to think about as well, which is when we have age encased in our law, it's a blunt instrument. And there are some cases where a blunt instrument is useful. So, for example, when you're dealing with millions of people, having the blunt instrument is useful. When you're dealing with a job interview, you might think not. So if you said, we won't hire anyone who's under the age of 18, that might very well just be an arbitrary form of discrimination, when you could very well evaluate the particular prospects of the person before you. You might have an incredibly bright 17-year-old who would work perfectly well in your company, and discriminating against them on the grounds of their age is unfair.
Thank you so much. You are tuned into the Wheels of Justice. In this episode, we are unpacking election eligibility and interrogating what constitutes both too young and too old. When we return, we'll continue this conversation, but also open our telephone lines for your contribution. Welcome back, Namibia. Thank you for staying with us. Our telephone number in the studio is 061-291-3339. That is 061-291-3339. Unless your intention is to make a prank call, you are at liberty to hit us up. So your calls are welcome. Right. Let's look at still other jurisdictions where, although registering to vote is voluntary, in some jurisdiction, voting is basically compulsory. Now, looking at that and what would be an ideal situation in a constitutional dispensation, would you think it would, that kind of practice where voting is made compulsory, would that basically be an ideal practice in a constitutional democracy?
Again, Daniel, it comes down to the context of that particular dispensation. Like you said yourself, in some countries it's compulsory, in other countries it's voluntary.
Yes.
I can only add this, or I can only say this about that. The reason voting is made compulsory in some jurisdictions or in some countries is to allow for broader participation in political activity. And failure to vote is usually married to offenses or penalties. For instance, if you don't vote, you will have to pay a certain fine over a certain period of time. But that is to increase voter participation, or to really ensure the obligation of civil responsibility is carried out by each and every citizen that has attained that particular age. Whereas in countries where it is voluntary, this is something that is done within the context of allowing individuals to express their freedom of their freedoms and their autonomy, the right to choose the decisions they make, the right to participate, and the right to choose not to participate. So it depends on the context of what the constitution of that country allows that particular person to do and what that particular constitution does not allow them to do. But you can't say it's one way or another because the context differs for different constitutions, if anything.
Yes. Perhaps, Advocate, there is this question that I really want you to help me understand. Advocate, are you there? Are you able to hear me?
Yes. So I think there's an interesting question about whether we conceive of voting as an obligation. And often people talk about this, that you must vote, that you owe a duty to your fellow citizens or to the nation to vote, or that in South Africa, where people fought and died for the right to vote, that therefore that creates an obligation, and that you are somehow doing something wrong when you fail to vote. I think this is mistaken. I think people fought for a right, and that you are free to exercise that right. And one reason why people might not vote is that they are so disgusted with the options that they have available to them that they cannot bear to endorse any of them. So you can imagine, if your choice is to vote for Hitler or Stalin, that fair answer is to say, I vote for neither. I cannot bear to vote for the Nazis or the communists. They both sicken me. Now in Australia, they have compulsory voting, and if you don't vote, you can be fined. And I think if you are to have a system like that, then one of the spots on the ballot ought to be a vote of no confidence, and that every person who votes for no confidence gets represented in Parliament with an empty seat, and that in order to pass any legislation, you have to have a majority of seats, and that all empty seats are counted automatically as no votes. I think that differentiates the person who doesn't care, who's an apathetic voter, versus the person who does care but doesn't like the options that are available to them. I generally think we ought to be wary about coercion, that you ought not to intrude on people's autonomy. And so Emmanuel has made the point that autonomy is important, and that seems to be a reason not to compel people to vote. You might think that a society in which you have low levels of participation indicates two things. The one is that it's going incredibly well. So if you look at many European countries, you have turnouts around 25%, because people feel that, you know, my society works, I don't have to worry about some sort of doomsday politician coming in and ruining everything. And the other one is which the politics is so bad that you feel that your vote will be meaningless, that it'll be rigged, and that there's no point in participating in that sort of outcome. In South Africa, our number of voters dropped quite significantly in our most recent election, and it's a pivotal election because we had a huge change in the electoral landscape. But that voter turnout is still quite a lot higher than you would find in Europe or America.
Wow, right. The advocate makes quite some fascinating points right there. Perhaps your take on that, especially the issue of autonomy.
If I would choose a perfect world, or a world in which I think is the way to go, is to allow people to choose whether to vote or not to vote. I mean, everybody is, or within the constitutional democracies that we live in, people have rights. You should not infringe on that particular person's right by telling them what to do. If you're telling somebody what to do, that should allow the right to not do what you want them to do.
What is your Leonard opinion? What comes first, or which one is subservient to the other? Is it democracy or constitutional principles? What should be in conformity with the other? Is it democracy conforming to the principles of the Constitution, or the constitutions must be crafted in a way that it conforms with the principles of democracy?
No, in my opinion, I would say it is democracy must be informed by a particular constitution, because we have different constitutions. We have different forms of democracy across the world. So when you take a look at the US, for instance, you have two-party democracy there. Here,
yes,
we have multi-party democracy.
Yes.
But all of them are informed by a constitution. It's not democracy that should inform the constitution. It's the constitution that should inform the democracy.
061-291-3339, 0291 339. That is our telephone line in the studio in case you want to ask a question or contribute. Your calls are welcome. Let's perhaps continue. When sizing up the various aspects of democracy's political participation, certain classes also seem to be a consideration, such as marital status, or those maybe working in army or law enforcement, and so on. Both the Namibian and South African supreme laws guarantees equality before the law. Now, would these class distinctions thus fly in the face of constitutional democracies?
I wouldn't say they would fly in the face of constitutional democracy, because it is those democracies it is the constitution that informs what is permissible and what is not permissible. I would, however, say that factors such as marriage, participation in military action should not be considerations when you allow people to vote, because you can only have so many soldiers in a country.
Yes.
And if you say only soldiers are supposed to vote, only people that are married are supposed to vote, are allowed to vote, that creates a very, very dangerous setting, because then you take out people. For instance, let's say the consideration is the unemployed people are not allowed to vote, but all of those that are employed are allowed to vote. And the majority in a country are those that do not have employed. So you want the rule of the minority to rule over the majority. In a constitutional dispensation, more often than not, the reason we have elections is so the majority vote prevails. And the context of that, I just don't believe is something that can be said is okay.
Advocate Oppenheimer, in Namibia, one need to be 35 if you aspire to be a president in this country. Is it the same case in South Africa?
Well, universal suffrage is seen as a very important value in South Africa because people were excluded from being able to vote on the grounds of their race and before on the grounds of their sex. You know, if you think about it, it took quite a long time for the world to allow women to vote. There are some interesting reasons why you might think that a special qualification is important to participate in a vote. So you can imagine, for example, a company having a vote on a particular issue and saying that only shareholders of the company can participate because their interests are directly affected by the decisions, or they have special knowledge of the intricacies of the business. And so, you know, arguments have been made about why you ought to qualify franchise in some sort of way. There's an interesting alternative, which is called epistocracy. So if democracy is ruled by the people, epistocracy is ruled by the knowers. And so you can imagine that when you go into the polling booth to vote, that you have to first answer a series of questions. And they could be general knowledge questions about science or history or geography or whatever it is, to kind of get a sense of your intellectual prowess and how seriously we ought to consider your vote. And so those that do very well on the test, their votes count more than those that fail the test. So that's one way in which you could take these things into account. The other one is that you could think that certain referendum issues which only hit a certain class of people, only those should be allowed to vote. So, for example, if you think about conscription, you could think that those that are going to be affected by conscription are likely to be men and are likely to be between the age of, let's say, 18 and 40. And that having other people vote about something that will affect them might be unfair to that class. So if you know I'll never have to serve in the army and risk my life, well then sure, I'm in favor of conscription. So often elderly voters are very much in favor of conscription because they think it'll teach the youth a lesson. Whereas the young might not be very keen on that because they have to put their bodies on the line and face death. And women might be, you know, ambivalent about the issue because it's unlikely they'll be conscripted unless you live in a country like Israel, which conscripts male and female soldiers. So it seems like on the particular issue, taking into account someone's other status might be the right thing to do, but maybe on a referendum basis as opposed to a general election where you're voting for a political party.
Right. Thank you so much, Advocate. I mean, I really wanted to ask if one aspiring for the highest office of the land in Namibia is basically you need to have attained 35 years. Wanted to know if it's the same in South Africa. Are you perhaps aware if it's the same?
I am not privy to that information.
But what do you make of that fact that there is a minimum age for one to vote? There is also a minimum age for one to aspire for
office?
For the public office, but there is no cap in terms of what is the maximum.
In terms of that, I would bring you back to to legal capacity or the legal age of majority.
Yes.
The age at which people are allowed to enter into contracts, to make decisions, to vote. That age, that particular minimum age, is to ensure that a person has enough experience, or a person has cognitively developed to a certain extent that they understand the complexities of decisions such as voting. So perhaps I would say I understand, I conform to the cap, the minimum.
Yes.
However, in terms of having to set a
maximum,
a cap for the maximum,
yes,
I personally wouldn't say that I am agreeable to that, because people manifest their maturity differently. You might find some people towards the age of 80 are senile, but you might find some people towards the age of 80 are still fresh. Their minds are still properly going on. So cutting a person off towards the age...
Wouldn't it be the same that you'd find some people at the age of 16 who are matured enough and they have capacity to think, they have ability to execute, to function properly?
Perhaps that is a point you can make. However,
yes,
the legal age of majority is the threshold there, and should be the threshold in terms of the Constitution,
yes,
as it has been set. However, when you go up, the older you become.
Yes.
I think the considerations that have to be taken there are, for instance, tests to make sure that these people are mentally and physically capable. If the age is so high that you might think that, but that is an old person. So perhaps you can put a yardstick to consider if that particular person is still okay enough to rule a country. But with age, as you grow older, you grow wiser and you gain experience. So you just can't cut somebody out because of their old age without making the determination that they are not fit and proper enough.
Yes. Advocate, other than death, resignation, or removal, no maximum age is prescribed by which a head of state needs to step down. What's your take? What happens if a sitting president becomes incapacitated?
I have not heard a word of what anyone has said in the last couple of minutes, so again I'm going to use my psychic abilities to guess what you said, and hopefully I won't repeat it. I gather that you're talking about age limits and whether we have them in South Africa. So the American Constitution has a requirement that you have to be, I think, 25 to be elected as president. We have no such requirement, and we have, I think, one of the youngest parliamentarians ever just been sworn in. I think she's about 21. We do have age limits when it comes to judges, that there are mandatory retirement ages. And the argument in favor of that is that we think that your cognitive capacities wane at some point. I think this became quite evident to a lot of people regarding someone like Joe Biden. And so they think that putting that person in a position of power could be quite dangerous, especially they have the nuclear codes. In South Africa, it's interesting that we don't think that about the president, but we do about the judges. So we think that judges ought to have to retire at some point because the caseload would be too burdensome, or they wouldn't be able to apply their minds properly to reach just outcomes. There is a sense in which, again, these ages could be kind of arbitrary. So in America, for example, the Supreme Court doesn't have a retirement age. You can resign as a judge or you remain being a judge up until you die. And so, there were judges in their late 80s, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a highly participating member of the court, and was able to produce quite astute judgments, as was someone like Antonin Scalia. So there might be an arbitrariness. You might also think that one way to deal with the concern that someone will cling on to power until they die is to rather have term limits as opposed to age restrictions. So you might think that one can only be in power for 2 terms, let's say 10 years, but that the voting public is quite well aware of someone's capacities and that you don't need to introduce the age cap. That it became quite obvious, for example, after President Biden's debate against Trump, that he lacked certain cognitive capacities and that would be in all likelihood unelectable. And so you didn't need to have a rule that says you can't run if you're over 80. He demonstrated his incapacity through his action. In South Africa, we do have a mechanism available to remove a president who becomes incapacitated, which is that if 2/3 of Parliament votes to find that they're incapacitated, that's a reason to have them removed. But it's not automatic. So you could have a situation where someone is clearly unable to do the job of president because of their age, that they're reached a high level of senility, but that there isn't the political will to have them removed.
Thank you so much, Advocate. Thank you for making time for the wheels of justice. Mr. Thomas, perhaps let me ask this last question. You don't then think that perhaps it's time we amend our constitution and our statutes to make provision for younger Namibians to vote and perhaps to put a cap also in terms of the high office? I'm
a young person, Mr. Nadunya, and I would say this, particularly within the context of what I've seen practically happening with it being election year. A lot of young people are very apathetic about voting. Many people don't really actually care about the politics of the day, or they do not engage enough in that. So I wouldn't say that it should be reduced. As it is currently, I feel it is enough. However, perhaps going forward, it is something that we can take a look at in changing in order to create a broader participation and civic education for voters across the board.
Thank you so much for making time for the wheels of justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nadunya.
And with that, we've come to the end of tonight's proceedings. We'll be back next Sunday, same time, same place. I'm Daniel Nadunya, but this session stands adjourned.